Hey guys, we're going to talk today about continuing the Israel-Palestine conflict from the Six-Day War up until the end of the Second Intifada, and going up a little bit more modern to talk a little bit about what's been going on in Israel, Palestine in the last couple of years, but we really won't be able to get that much in depth. So last we talked, we were on the eve of the Six-Day War. There was increasing escalation between Israel and the Arab states surrounding it. And then we get the Six-Day War, in which Israel mounts a surprise attack against Egypt. And by first they attack the Egyptian Air Force, really decimating that Air Force, and then conquer through Sinai and circle around to the Gaza Strip, conquering that area on June 8th. Using ground forces, they're able to force the Jordanians to retreat and conquer the West Bank. And then in Syria with the Golan Heights, they start with an air attack that wipes out the Air Force and invade on the ground, capturing the Golan Heights on June 10th. The Israeli military suffered incredibly few casualties in this war, less than 1,000. I think it's 983. Whereas about 20,000 Arab soldiers died. So it's really a very devastating war on the Arab side and a very victorious one on the Israeli side. So following this war, the Arab states joined together and established a three-point policy. The first is that they will refuse to create peace with Israel, that they will refuse to recognize the state of Israel as a valid state, and that they will refuse to negotiate with Israel. And this is going to be important in the 1980s. So this is the new map of Israel. They've conquered the Sinai, they've conquered the Golan Heights up here, and they've conquered the West Bank. Another 300,000 Palestinians become refugees. So the time period between 1967 and 1987 is really a period of tension. There's really this constant escalation. The PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, has this policy of using violence, that what we would call terrorism. If you heard about what happened in the Munich Olympics in 1972, Palestinian terrorists stormed the Olympic compound and kidnapped and killed 11 Israeli wrestlers and their coaches. They hijacked planes, they hijacked cruise ships, they bombed school buses, it's just really constant violence, because from the PLO perspective, this is an existential conflict for which violence is justified. And it's about 450 Israeli civilians are killed between 67 and 87. And in retaliation, Israel will shoot down Israeli planes. They'll assassinate these leaders and sometimes get some collateral damage. And they also really do escalate the size and scale of their military, because from the Israeli perspective, they are under constant attack. And we really don't have clear numbers on how many Palestinians die from Israeli security actions during this time, and even less clarity on how many of those Palestinians were civilians and how many were fighting against, how many were legitimate military targets. So in 1973, there was tension from 1967 with the Six-Day War till 1973, and Egypt really wants to regain the Sinai Peninsula, but knows that they cannot negotiate with Israel. They cannot start a peaceful negotiation process, because they've already promised that they will not negotiate to create a peace with Israel. So what they want to do is start this war so that they can enter into discussions with Israel to regain the Sinai. So on Yom Kippur, October 6th, 1973, Egypt, and primarily Syria attack Israel through the Sinai, and this was Yom Kippur, a day of atonement, where most Jews spend the day fasting in synagogues. So this was seen as sort of an underhanded move, and it took it took some time for the Israelis to be able to mobilize. The Israelis eventually they lost more soldiers than they normally do in wars, and they also had to rely on an airlift from the United States. And so Israel ultimately wins this war, but it has some devastating consequences for the future for both Israel and Egypt. So almost 3,000 soldiers died, 250 or 2,500 to 2,900, and about 8,000 Arab soldiers. But when you bear in mind the size of the military, both sort of suffered proportional losses. Israel was sort of horrified that they were not prepared for this surprise attack and that they had not launched a preemptive strike. So this sets the stage for increasing Israeli militarization. They are now going to take a policy of active preemptive strikes to prevent a future attack, and to perhaps to the Israeli psyche, this just reinforces the idea that they are essentially fighting for their right to exist. That if they let their guards down, even for religious celebrations, even for a day, that they will be wiped off the map. So there's no real territory that changes hands. Maybe, a couple thousand square miles, but nothing that would really show up on a map. But it does set the stage for there being a peace agreement in the near future, which is in 5 years after the 73 war. There is the Camp David Accords, which are secret treaty agreements between Israel, Menachem Begin, Egypt with Anwar Sadat, and the United States, Jimmy Carter, as president. And these are secret agreements. They meet, they set up a plan for Middle East peace, win the Nobel Peace Prize. Nothing actually happens. There's very little real changes based on this meeting, but it is the first push towards peace. The only real thing that happens is that Israel leaves Israel leaves Sinai and gives it back to Egypt. And this is an unpopular move in Egypt, but the fact that Egypt negotiated with Israel, recognized the state of Israel, which they do in the Camp David Accords, and signed a peace treaty with Israel, shows that it goes against what the Arab states, the solidarity of the Arab states. So in 78, Anwar Sadat is assassinated for signing this treaty. Signing this treaty and recognizing the state of Israel leads to his death, which shows that this has turned into a very sort of devastating conflict and ideological. So in 1987, we see the beginning of what's called the Intifada. The Intifada means shaking off, and it's the idea that there's going to be, much like perhaps the Quit India movement in India, this is going to be a directed campaign of direct action, protests, riots, strikes, what have you, against Israeli rule of Palestinians. They do not want to be ruled by Israel. And so in 87 they start this, and in retaliation, the Israeli military often will use what might be seen as a disproportional response. For people who are protesting, they'll fire rubber bullets or they'll use tear gas. But when you understand that Israel perceives that as a threat to its existence, it makes a little bit more sense why they might use such strict measures. This is the conflict in which Hamas is founded, which is a much more radical group than Fatah, which we talked about yesterday. Hamas is more representative of what's going on in Gaza, whereas Fatah is the West Bank. About 164 Israelis were killed between 87 and 91, which is the first Intifada, and about 1,000 Palestinians were killed during that same time by Israeli forces. And then in Palestinian infighting and execution of collaborators, Palestinians who work with Israel, another 1,000 Palestinians were killed. And this is sort of the start of a trend you're going to notice from 91 on, is that the Israeli retaliation against Palestinian violence often exceeds the death toll of the Palestinian violence, so it tries to serve as a deterrent, and that the infighting between Palestinians often matches or comes close to the death toll of Palestinians from Israeli actions. So you see that there starts to be a splintering among the Palestinians, and that Israel has taken a very strong policy of military strength, of deterrent force, and of preemptive strikes, which fits into their understanding of themselves in an existential crisis or existential attack. So between 91 and 2000, the end of the first Intifada, and 2000, which is the beginning of the second Intifada, the rest of the world is trying to create peace in the Middle East. And so in 93, Israel and Palestine signs the Oslo Accord, which says that Israel is going to no longer directly administer Gaza and the West Bank. They're handing control over to the Palestinian Authority, which is created between the PLO and the Israeli government. They create the Palestinian National Authority, which is supposed to be an interim government where eventually a true governing body will be created. After this, it never was. There never was a new Palestinian government. The Palestinian Authority remains in control to this day. Well, remained in control until about 2007. And from about 2007 on, Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, or what goes into particularly Gaza. There's been a blockade of Gaza since 2007, ostensibly to prevent bombs being made in Gaza and shot into Israel. However, there's been some documents that have been released that indicate that the blockade of Gaza is politically motivated and designed to break down Palestinian resistance. In 2007, what sort of prompted this blockade is conflict between Fatah and Hamas, the two major political parties of the Palestinians. Hamas now controls Gaza and Fatah controls the West Bank. They've split. So the Second Intifada starts in 2000, when the Israeli Prime Minister, who was then Ariel Sharon, who was the former Israeli Minister of Defense, who was behind a massacre, or who was seen to be behind a massacre at a Palestinian refugee camp during the Lebanese Civil War in 1983. He visits the Temple Mount, and he visits a mosque there, and this is seen as sort of a slap in the face, and so Palestinians begin protesting, and the reaction to that protest is violent. So the Second Intifada lasts for about 5 years. 1,000 Israelis are killed, 7,000 are injured, so that's 8,000 casualties total, the majority of whom are civilians, and it's about 3,000 Palestinians who are killed during this period as well. So another issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict is the presence of what are known as Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So that is when Israelis start moving to the area captured in the 1967 war, even when after that territory has been given back to Palestinians for Palestinian control. About 600,000 or more Israelis live in the settlements, with tens of thousands moving there each year. The Israeli government continuing to build new settlements. Generally, the international community sees these settlements as illegal, as an occupation of territory that they do not have the right to live in. But the Israeli government continues to build new settlements and essentially refuses to engage in a peace process that would require them to stop building settlements and to evacuate or to withdraw the settlers. These settlements represent a real sticking point, and also are the sites of much of the violence between Israel, the Jewish and Palestinian communities, where there were roughly, in 2013, roughly 280 attacks on both sides. That 280 settlers attacks of Palestinians from settlers, and then about 280 Israelis attacked by the Palestinians. This is a real sticking point. And you can see here that this is a pretty nifty graphic that shows the loss of land among the Palestinians. So here, this is the land that they have, the land they have right before the official partition. This is the land they are intended to have in the partition. This is considered to be the broad area that is the West Bank and Gaza, and that from 67 really onwards, the land that is given to the Palestinians is being sort of encroached upon. The population is growing as time goes on. There are more people, so that there's a real squeeze over the land. So looking at the issues that are facing this current crisis, there's a bunch that we want to talk about. So the first one, and we haven't really touched on it, is the right of return. Palestinian exiles from 48 and their descendants feel that they should have the right to return to Palestine as citizens, and that is what they want. And while perhaps Israel could support the return of 700,000 refugees, they could not at all support the return of 5 million refugees and still maintain a majority Jewish state. They would lose their majority and thus lose their essential right to rule. Another issue is Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Can they continue? Is the Israeli government going to withdraw those settlers, or are they going to continue expansion? The blockade of Gaza. The blockade of Gaza lasted from 2007, and Israel began to ease it in 2010. And I do want to note that Gaza is also blockaded from Egypt, the Egyptian border. Egypt will not send in support because they don't want to be seen as supporting Hamas. There's a blockade of the ports, and even though that's been eased, there's still, slight, not malnutrition, but there is deprivation. There's a question of where the new borders, if there is going to be a two-state solution, where they are going to be, as well as, the question of security is sort of most interesting. Is, there are Palestinian attacks on the state of Israel. As you hear in the news, there are rockets being fired by Hamas into Israel. And if you follow the sort of traditional definition of what a state is, Israel does have the right to self-defense. But then you have to wonder where that that boundary is and how to solve this problem. And then if there is a one-state solution and Israelis and Palestinians live together in one state, moving freely, what are going to be the civil rights? Because, once again, if all of the Palestinians in Israel get full legal rights, then the Israeli or perhaps Jewish majority is going to be severely weakened, which would perhaps change what Israel is as a state. Because if Israel is the homeland for the Jews, can it offer full citizenship to non-Jews? There was one more thing I wanted to, just the international community. The UN recognizes the state of Palestine as a non-member observer, but that it is recognized. Many, many countries are beginning to recognize, particularly in Europe, are beginning to recognize the state of Palestine as a nation, although there are not borders and there's also not a clear unified government because of the Hamas-Fatah split. So what I'd like you to do is get in pairs or in groups of 3. Take the rest of the class to really try and figure out if there is a solution. Should there be a plebiscite where essentially all the population, including Palestinians and Israelis, vote to figure it out? Should there be a two-state solution? And if so, where will those borders be? And how can both states protect the security of their people? Would Israel be willing to have a land bridge connecting Gaza and the West Bank in regard to their security? How would the international community respond? The Palestinians and the Arabs were previously supported by the Soviet Union, and Israel has been supported quite heavily by the United States, militarily, financially, and politically. So how would they react to this two-state solution? How would Israel go through a sort of a reevaluation of who they are as a state? So take some time and work through this, and in your pairs, hand them in at the end of class. I want you to write them down. And shoot me an email if you have any questions. And I think it's also somewhat important to note that this is one of those issues that if you get 5 people in a room, you're going to get 10 different opinions, that there is a huge variety of opinions on this issue and a huge variety of perspectives on what has happened. I've tried very hard to give as neutral a description of this conflict as possible and explain why both sides have done what they've done, because even though many of these decisions made by state actors might seem irrational or over-exaggerated, it really, all of them are based in some perception of the world and some rational or semi-rational fear. And so try and see if you can find a solution for this conflict that Israel, Palestine, and the international community would agree with. All right.